Greetings. I am Dr. Graciela Caneiro Livingston, Provost at Nebraska Wesleyan University. I want to welcome you to this year's presentation of Spooky Evenings. We here at Nebraska Wesleyan are excited and proud of this event that brings together scholars, artists, authors, and filmmakers to discuss the topic of horror in its various manifestations across the arts and the humanities. Professor Juan Jose Castaño Marquez and Dr. Matthew Jarvis have been working tirelessly to bring you the best scholarship in the field of horror through this unparalleled digital humanities event. I would like to acknowledge the generous support from the Nebraska Arts Council, Humanities Nebraska, and the Nebraska Cultural Endowment that helps make quality programming like Spooky Evenings possible. Again, welcome and enjoy this presentation of Spooky Evenings.
Tonight on Spooky Evenings, Dr. Maury Leeder of the University of Manitoba presenting a talk entitled Narration and Damnation in Angelheart. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to my guest, Maury Leeder. Welcome, sir.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
My great pleasure. Tonight you're giving us a talk on one of my favorite films, Angelheart. I feel like this doesn't get enough due, so I'm glad somebody is giving it some due.
All right. Do you want me to just take it away to start sharing my screen, or?
Yes, please. We welcome you to begin your talk, Narration and Damnation in Angelheart.
Narration and Damnation, yes. And part of me wonders if I should contract that into a neologism like damnation or something like that. Then this is probably fine the way that it is. So I'll start off by saying that some years ago, like 5 years ago or so, I was tempted by the devil, by which I mean that I was invited by Jeffrey Weinstock to contribute to a collection that would ultimately bear the name Giving the Devil His Due, Satan and Cinema, seen here, and also seen here, because my copy arrived in the mail a few weeks ago. It's a terrific book I highly recommend for all the chapters other than mine, and maybe even for mine as well. I, of course, gave into this temptation, and there's some back and forth about what films, what topics had been assigned, and one that I realized hadn't was Angelheart. So I agreed to contribute a paper on Alan Parker's 1987 lurid retro-noir horror hybrid of that title, Angelheart. Based on William Hortzberg's novel Falling Angel from 1978, Angelheart follows the classic structure of a detective film impeccably, but arrives at a conclusion seemingly anathema to the detective genre, one that obligates us to accept a supernatural explanation. In this case, literally, the devil made me do it. I should say, too, that as part of that process, I was also working on my book, Horror Film, A Critical Introduction. So there was a bit of cross-fertilization between those projects. And that's the reason why I end up talking about Angelheart so much in that book as well. Angelheart foregrounds its links with Faust and Oedipus Rex, and also, I argue, stages a kind of commentary on classical narration itself. Any film with a shocking climactic twist, such as Angelheart has, depends on the careful withholding and disclosure of narrative information. But in Angelheart, this process is explicitly diabolical, being managed by the devil himself. I will argue here that the devil is not merely a character in Angelheart, but is constructed as an agent of narration itself, an internal incarnation of the implied author, and as such, he is an evolution of the Milesian author devil of early cinema, who not only works tricks of light and shadow, but also of narrative manipulation. Just to note, one thing that I will not particularly be doing here is discussing Angelheart's racial politics, which can at a minimum be described as peculiar or inscrutable, and much more could be said about this. So I'll point you to some sources that I've listed here that do. I likewise not have a lot to say about the film's depiction of voodoo, a topic in which I'm not especially well versed. At a minimum, I'll observe that the film, while not quite conflating voodoo and Satanism, places them into close proximity. And the central motif of the film is the white private detective's reluctant entry into black spaces in both Harlem and New Orleans, both of which are presented as exotic and bewildering. It also evokes, as the Coen brothers' "Oh Brother, Where Art Thou" later would, the blues lore of a magician, usually Robert Johnson, of course, selling his soul to the devil, but here displaces that story onto the white crooner. And of course, the film also plays the tragic mulatta archetype extremely straight. But for now, onto the devil. One striking feature of depictions of Satan in cinema is how the devil is very often a character not entirely contained by the story's internal reality. Sometimes a demonic character will even break the fourth wall and look out at the audience directly. The most famous example is, of course, at the end of The Omen. But there's similar moments of direct address at the end of The Devil and Daniel Webster and Torture Garden, among others, in which the devil half warns the viewer that that they are next, that they are the next to be subject to temptation, and half invites the viewer into the devil's demonic confidence. The fact that the devil exceeds narrative bounds proves relevant to Angelheart, and we can look for the roots of this phenomenon in cinema's early history. In his trick films, Georges Méliès would depict devils and almost as frequently enact them himself. Here is one example among many. The Untamable Whiskers was the English title of this one. So the devil is climaxed there. The cheerfully anti-clerical Méliès often played an internal incarnation of the magician auteur, enacting tricks through cinema, which have a kind of diabolical character to them. And he enacted the role of Mephistopheles in many films, including several adaptations of the Faust legend. Writing in 1937, John Grierson, the popularizer, of course, of the term documentary, lamented how cinema's initial realist potential was swiftly redirected or misdirected into hell. He writes, "Hardly were the workmen out of the theater and the apple digested than cinema was taking a trip to the moon, and only a year or two later, a trip in full color to the devil. The Scarlet Women were in, and the high falsehood of trickery and artifice was in, and reality and the first fine careless rapture were out." In 1913, arguing for the potential pedagogical value of the cinema, Robert W. Neal wrote of making the devil useful, asserting that the moving picture is not an invention of the devil. There is a great deal in it, and at the present stage of development, that we have to think of with all optimistic faith summonable in order not to regard it as excessively satanic. Just satanic enough, I suppose, not excessively satanic. Like Grierson, Neal thought the cinema was ultimately salvageable for social or pedagogical purposes, but couched this optimism within the discourse of the condemnation that the moving picture devil had attracted. These iconophobic treatments of cinema can be attached to a much longer narrative in Western culture of the distrust of systems of the visual, where cultural imagination has often located the devil. According to Marina Warner, the devil's medium was enigma, illusion, darkling sight. In medieval Christian traditions, he is a mimic, an actor, a performance artist, and he imitates the wonders of nature and the divine work of creation. But unlike God, St. Augustine decided, the devil cannot perform real miracles or alter real phenomena. He is merely the ape of God, the master of lies, of imitating and simulating and pretending. The devil's powers are thus tied to the authorial powers of a figure who manipulates light and shadow, like a film director, and especially a trick film director like Méliès. In André Gaudreau's terminology, Méliès was a monstrateur, or exhibitor, shower. His sometimes Mephistophelian presence within his own tricks extend to his extra-narrative authorial role as a conjurer and furnisher of thrills and tricks. Kevin Heffernan borrows the term monstrateur from Gaudreau to describe the presence of an author-magician in many horror films, which he sees as an evolution of Méliès's internal avatars. He writes, "In many horror films, the narrative storytelling process is often enacted by a magician or trickster figure who accompanies his acts of sorcery with elaborate gestures to the audience that have their origins in the deliberately distracting sleight of hand of the stage magician." Heffernan locates this figure within horror film as being a master of shocking display and a storyteller, like Henry Gerald, Vincent Price's character in House of Wax from 1953, who is implicitly not fully contained within the story world. Interestingly, in the novel Falling Angel, the source novel for Angelheart, it involves stage magic far more directly. Its version of the devil, Louis Cypher, is himself a performer with no fewer than two magician personas, a traditional European-style tuxedo magician named Dr. Cypher, and a pseudo-Arabian persona called El Cypher. This explicit invocation of stage magic is absent from Angelheart. I'll speak about the implications of that choice later. Okay, so Angelheart. I'm going to assume that most people watching this have seen it, and it is the kind of film, like a puzzle film, where you just can't get very far talking about it without explaining the entire arc of the plot. So at this point, I'm going to go ahead and do that. Angelheart takes place in 1955. Starts out in New York City. Oh, spoiler warning. Sorry, I didn't remember that I needed that slide there. So yeah, Harry Angel, played by Mickey Rourke, it is Mickey Rourkeist, is a private investigator working in 1955 New York. He is hired by the mysterious Louis Cypher That the name is pronounced differently almost every time it's said, which I suspect is picking up the novel's motif of him having him spelling it differently in these different magician personas. So he's hired by Louis Cypher, played by Robert De Niro. I'll just linger here. Probably people don't need a lot of time on this. Cypher hires Harry Angel to locate the crooner Johnny Favorite, whose contract with Cypher was interrupted when Favorite was hospitalized from shell shock during the war. That's the story we're told, at least. Harry's search for Johnny leads him to numerous old associates of Johnny, first in upstate New York and then in New Orleans. He finds entanglement with music, a wealthy Louisiana family, voodoo, and devil worship. Notably, virtually every person Harry comes into contact with for information turns up dead afterwards in increasingly gory ways. In New Orleans, Harry locates Favorite's illegitimate daughter, Epiphany Proudfoot, a voodoo practitioner with a young son, and they become lovers. Ultimately, it becomes clear that Johnny has sold his soul to the devil for success, and subsequently used a soul-switching occult ritual in order to attempt to renege on the contract. Johnny and his collaborators kidnapped a young soldier celebrating New Year's Eve in Times Square and sacrificed him, with Johnny subsequently taking on his life. That soldier was Harry Angel. Having lost any knowledge of his prior life, Harry has been unwittingly tasked with finding himself. When Harry retrieves a hidden set of dog tags bearing his name, Cypher, who tried to contain your shock, is the devil, appears and confirms his story. He has contrived events in order to retrieve Johnny Favorite's stolen soul, hidden within Harry. What's more, the film's numerous murders were actually committed by Harry himself, operating in a kind of dissociative state. Discovering Epiphany, both his daughter and his lover, sadistically killed using his gun, Harry gives himself up to the police, acknowledging that he is now fated for punishment both on Earth and in hell. So that's the damnation part. Let's talk about narration. And like all discussions, this one eventually turns to Russian formalism. So let me briefly introduce the Russian formalist distinction between story and plot, fabula and sujet, which has proved broadly influential on studies of film narration in general and of the detective film more specifically. So the distinction here is that the fabula describes the chronological cause and effect chain of events that includes all events directly depicted or implied, whereas the sujet is a selective presentation which is not necessarily in chronological order and may obscure cause and effect through selective omissions. While all narrative films, and indeed any medium, indeed narratives of any medium, have a fabula and a sujet, detective stories are considered remarkable because they foreground the working of a sujet on a fabula, with unanswered questions about cause and effect driving forward the narrative and providing suspense. In Angelheart, the question, who is Johnny Favorite, a mystery to Harry and the audience, or pardon me, where is Johnny Favorite, a mystery to Harry and the audience alike, drives the early part of the plot, and is swiftly accompanied by other questions like who is murdering Favorite's associates and what does Cypher really want, things like this. Angelheart introduces so many characters and colorful details that it discourages the viewer from speculating about the really important question until the end, and that question is, who is Harry Angel? Sujets are distinguished by a relative degree of restriction. So you can have some where narrative information is kept fairly tight, like you might learn it only as a single character does. These are often films that have a kind of first-person feel because they're limited to the perspective of one character. Rear Window is a good example of that. While other films like large ensemble dramas and things like that have a relatively unrestricted sujet, and so we can follow many, many characters and get information many different ways. And usually the cost of that is relatively psychologically shallow characters. In Angelheart, the narrative is extremely restricted. It's restricted to the extent that we get information only, almost only as Harry Angel gets it. Now, in the novel, he's the first-person narrator, so we have this sort of first-person feel carrying over. He's in almost every scene of the film, and the perspective of the audience is firmly wedded to his, reinforced by frequent point of view shots from his perspective. At the end of the film, it becomes clear that we have misunderstood some of what's transpired because Harry has misunderstood it. And that some of the images that we see, for example, him sitting passively in a diner, may not have happened at all, since we later learn that he was actually committing a murder at that point. David Bordwell represents a detective story fabula with this schema. So it's broken into these two phases, the crime phase and the investigation phase. So this is essentially the story of a crime film, of any crime film for the most part, but not the plot of a crime film. Certainly not the plot of a detective film, because of course we don't know in a detective film what the cause of the crime is, the commission of the crime. Those are things that we learn later. Usually in a detective film, we might start here or perhaps here and eventually get these things filled in via exposition, even via flashbacks potentially. In Angelheart, the crime takes place a dozen years before the film starts in 1943. And so this is the kidnapping and ritual murder of the real Harry Angel, or the original Harry Angel, motivated by Johnny Favorite's attempt to renege on the promise of his soul to the devil. Essentially, it is two crimes in one: the earthly crime of murder and the metaphysical crime of grand theft soul. The concealment of the crime is so complete that the killer himself doesn't even know about it. So we kind of skip over a discovery of the crime. That's relocated at the very end, you might say. The investigation phase dominates Angelheart, with the twist being that Harry's investigations into Johnny ultimately lead him to an intolerable self-realization. At the film's climax, we become aware that the film's sujet has excluded key information, not only about the crime phase, as one expects in a detective film, but also about the investigation phase, because Harry, the character to whom our perspective is limited, has failed to retain it. He murdered at least 5 people himself, but did not know it at the time, so neither do we. Only at the film's climax are these missing pieces of the fabula conveyed to us through intercut flashbacks. If one canonical Western literary work underpinning Angelheart is surely Faust, the story of a deal with the devil, another is Sophocles' Oedipus Rex, the story of a man unwittingly investigating himself. Trying to solve the problem of a plague on Thebes, Oedipus searches for the murderer of King Laius, who is himself. Unintentional incest is, of course, a motif in both stories as well, and Oedipus Rex has been treated as a kind of detective narrative, in which the question, what happened in the past to make the present as it is inseparable from the question, who am I? Angelheart introduces so many characters, colorful details, that it discourages speculation about that. The film's treatment of Harry is simultaneously close and distant. We know little enough about his backstory, yet we witness his private moments and even his dreams. Genre conventions often supply viewers with information that does not need to be validated in other ways. And the fact that a film, in general, a film noir detective rarely has an intricate backstory, combines with the typecasting of Rourke as this rough-hewn Brooklynite in a hat and a shabby raincoat, discourages speculation about Harry's true identity. We seem to have all the information about him required from the first scene, basically. Only in retrospect do his brief recollections about getting a little fucked up during the war prove narratively relevant. Let us ask another different but hopefully still relevant question. What kind of film is Angelheart, generically speaking? As we've already seen, it is structured as a detective film, but the revelation that Cypher is the devil and that Harry is Johnny falls well outside of what a detective story traditionally permits. Indeed, part of the detective story decalogue prepared by Father Ronald A. Knox in 1929 was that all supernatural or preternatural agencies are ruled out as a matter of course. Angelheart clearly does not hold to this rule, but Harry operates under the misplaced certainty that he is in a narrative where any phenomenon, however strange, will eventually prove to have a naturalistic explanation. He even accuses Cypher of merely impersonating the devil during his final confrontation, because his worldview aligns with the presumptive materialism of detective story rather than a supernatural horror story about the devil. He's in the wrong genre, basically. He doesn't realize what kind of movie he's in. When Cypher wonders, if I had cloven hales and a pointed tail, would you be more convinced? The line confronts Harry and any audience member with lingering hesitation about whether or not he is the real devil. And as we'll see later, the film goes so far as to erase any ambiguity. Since genres are not defined only through narrative, but also through style and tone, it is noteworthy that while Angelheart is full of traditional film noir aesthetics, chiaroscuro lighting, rundown urban spaces, rain, mirrors, stairways, mournful saxophones, etc., these coexist with a different set of principles, more drawn from horror cinema. There is this black-clad, genderless figure that makes fleeting appearances throughout the film, in scenes coded as both in reality and in dream sequences. This dark, mysterious figure is somewhat suggestive of supernatural horror conventions. There's also gore, of which the film has plenty. And while detective stories are often violent, they're not often quite so gory. And the two are linked to each other because the figure in black is actually introduced cleaning blood from a wall. We're told that it's the blood of a suicide that is not otherwise explained. I would suggest, however, that Angelheart should be seen as literalizing a horrific subtext within film noir. The downbound elevator connoting Bridget O'Shaughnessy's Damnation in Maltese Falcon becomes a literal trip to hell in Angelheart. Noir subjects like amnesia and plastic surgery get supernatural twists in Angelheart as well. The best example of a noir image turned to supernatural horror is ventilation fans, common sight in the overheated milieu and cramped cityscapes of many film noirs. Angelheart repeatedly displays them to suggest pentagrams, hexagrams, and swastikas. Throughout the film, the viewer is given to wonder whether such imagery is pure symbolism or something more. And in retrospect, we can read it as the film's tipping its hand repeatedly about its true supernatural character. On both formal and narrative levels, Angelheart proves to be less a competition, I would say, between the detective story and the horror story, as a demonstration of their commensurability. It is not either or, it is both. Through Angelheart's status, though Angelheart's status as a horror film only becomes fully evident towards the end. This trajectory mirrors the audience's understanding of Louis Cypher himself. Wealthy, cultured, calculating, and brilliant, he is akin to characters like Caspar Gutman in The Maltese Falcon, Walter Lydecker in Laura, or Noah Cross in Chinatown, but with their figurative devilry made literal. Cypher also looks ahead to Kaiser Soze in The Usual Suspects, himself repeatedly likened to the devil. Like Cypher, Soze is a narrator who works his diabolical manipulations not just on characters, but on the audience as well. And I think if we watch the film's original trailer, we'll see that it was marketed pretty explicitly as a generic hybrid. It's not the case that it was marketed as one kind of film or the other.
The Exorcist, the possession of the human soul. Chinatown, the mystery of the human mind. Now.
Do you know what today is? Today is Wednesday. So anything can happen today.
My interest in Johnny is only in finding out if he's alive or if he's dead.
You want me to check it out?
Check it out.
Who are you?
I'm just the guy who was paid to snoop around. I'm gonna ask you again. Where is he? I don't know.
Harry Angel has been hired to solve more than a mystery.
He's dead, Mr. Angel. And if he isn't, he is to me.
Are you afraid?
Yeah, I'm afraid.
To find more than a killer.
We don't go around murdering people, all right, Mr. Angel?
prince of darkness protects the powerful. You expect me to swallow that?
And it may cost him more than his life.
Some religions think that the egg is the symbol of the soul. Did you know that?
All I know is Johnny's running around bumping off everyone he used to know. And more it's me who's on the line for it.
Johnny's favorite was as close to true evil as she ever wanted to come.
There's death everywhere these days.
You killed him. And you're trying to pin it on me.
The flesh is weak. Only the soul is immortal. Did you kill him? You gotta burn for this, Angel. You gotta burn for this, Angel.
In hell.
Harry Angel has been hired to search for the truth. Pray he doesn't find it. Angelheart.
A lurid trailer for a lurid film, and I must say it's a special kind of trailer that includes the very last spoken dialogue from a film and the very last image from a film too. All a little bit of a giveaway. So what I'd like to do here is move back to the point that the devil in the original source novel, Falling Angel, acts as a literal magician, and this element is removed from Angelheart. I'm going to suggest that it was removed because it's redundant. There's no need for him to stage such trickery within Angelheart because Angelheart is his trick. Cypher is the evolution of the Méliès style Mephistopheles / showman / auteur, and works his powers less with spectacle than with narrative. As Karen Beckman puts it, continuous narrative is a trick. The fact that Robert De Niro appears to be impersonating his friend and frequent collaborator Martin Scorsese while playing Cypher is thus something more than pure trivia. Cypher, however, is less tied to the specific authorship of an individual director like Scorsese or Parker than to the abstract and depersonalized authority of the cinematic narrator. The term, so I'm not using narrator in a strictly oral sense, although Cypher occasionally is that too, but rather an agent responsible for the unfolding of a film's sujet, of its plot. Bordwell cites Walter Booth's conception of the implied author, the invisible puppeteer, not a speaker or visible presence, but an omnipresent artistic figure behind a work. Bordwell argues that this is not a useful concept in most narrative films, stating that in watching films, we are seldom aware of being told something by an entity resembling a human being. No trait that we could assign to an implied author of a film could more simply be ascribed to narration itself. It sometimes suppresses information, it often restricts our knowledge, it generates curiosity, it creates a tone, and so on. To give every film a narrator or implied author is to indulge in an anthropomorphic fiction. And while I'm not in substantial disagreement with this statement, I will suggest that in Angelheart, Cypher is constructed as basically that, the anthropomorphic incarnation of a narrator or implied author, and in particular, a diabolical aspect thereof, which is out to trick and mislead an audience, a process that is hopefully pleasurable to the audience, even as is rarely so to the characters. Cypher is a visible and audible presence, yes, but it's also clear that his presence on screen is an illusory and temporary manifestation that fails to convey the devil's true nature. This is underscored by his impossibly varying hair and fingernail lengths at different points in the film. He is also an invisible puppeteer who strips and guides all of Harry's actions. He controls and regulates the amount of narrative information that Harry and thereby the audience possesses. So here's a question that comes up, for me at least, on repeated viewings of Angelheart. If Cypher's motivation is to retrieve Johnny's soul from Harry, why doesn't he just do it? Like, what is in fact stopping him from doing it at any moment? Why does Cypher need Harry to go through the process of the investigation in order to learn his true identity as Johnny Favorite? Put differently, why what prevents Cypher from simply reclaiming Johnny's soul from Harry at the beginning of the film, or for that matter, years before the film even starts? Presumably, Cypher wants or needs Harry to reach the self-realization through his own detective work. The other reason is, of course, narrative delay. Cypher could hypothetically divulge everything he knows in the first scene, but if he does that, there's no further story. This is one of the narrator's implied fortunes, more obvious in a detective film than other genres, to dole out narrative information in a partial and potentially misleading fashion, thus preventing the reaching of a climax and closure too precipitously. Let us watch the final confrontation between Cypher and Harry. This is right near the end of the film, which occurs just after Harry locates the hidden dog tags that proves that he is the soldier who was ritually murdered by Johnny Favorite. So a number of things are noteworthy in that sequence. Oedipus Rex is actually explicitly cited. The line about how terrible wisdom is when it brings no profit to the wise, that Cypher states is a line from the blind seer Tiresias in Oedipus Rex, who is also the epigraph to the novel. But I'm interested in particular in the status of the intercut images that we see. So what we have here is classic flashbacks. They're images of earlier events in the fabula. So we might understand them as Harry's suppressed memories now returning to them, or just provided for the audience's sake, providing those gaps in the narrative that we didn't experience earlier for the sake of completing our ability to visualize the whole plot line. But I'll suggest that it doesn't really matter. However we read these images, they're triggered both by narrative necessity in order to confirm that what Cypher is saying is true, and by Cypher's own will, because the 1 and 2 are essentially the same. In that sequence, unfortunately, it wasn't in the clip, but we see Cypher present in this location before Harry arrives. So this is one of the first times we break away from his perspective. We know something before he does. And we see another example of that right after that clip, in the final appearance of the figure in black that Harry rushes by without seemingly noticing that it's there at all. And for the first time, we get a close-up revealing that the figure in black too is a version of Louis Cypher, a version of the devil, here played by a clean-shaven De Niro from a different stage of production. There's a certain self-reflexive commentary on the nature of how films are put together inherent in that image too as well. But I would like to suggest that what we have near the end of the film here is a breakdown in the film's restricted narration, where up to this point we've learned things, saw things, understood things almost exclusively as Harry does. And that what we have here are moments that puncture that, where it moves to a more unrestricted format, where we see things that he doesn't see, doesn't know. And we have maybe a version of that demonic direct address, which it's not the most model example because he's not looking right into the camera, but it's a similar example of that unfolding near the end of the narrative. So structurally, it's a little like Citizen Kane in that respect, where Citizen Kane, for most of its narrative, has a tightly restricted narration based on the investigator Thompson, and only at the very end does it supply we, the audience, with information in a more omniscient format. The nature of Rosebud is not known to Thompson, it's known only to us, and literally no other character knows it. Angelheart has been described as a film in which the devil wins. Carol Fry refers to it in those terms in an early article that she wrote on the film. I would suggest that that's not even quite true. The devil doesn't win in the film so much as he doesn't need to win. There's literally no competition. Cypher does not play the game so much as control the game. Closure, the target of a traditional narrative, means closing off chains of causality and filling in unresolved narrative gaps, though that process is perhaps never a complete one. David Bordwell notes that it's more properly seen as pseudo-closure or closure effect. Angelheart ends as a detective story is supposed to, with the apprehension of a criminal and his punishment. Only in this case, the criminal and the detective are one and the same. Harry is two men, who is two men and one, is simultaneously guilty and innocent. His punishment is thus both deserved and undeserved. The ending provides closure, but not catharsis. Closure is Cypher's explicit goal, since it means retrieving the soul that he wants so badly. Earlier, Cypher remarks, "I don't like messy accounts." And indeed, virtually every character associated with Johnny Favorite is now dead at the end of the narrative, the guilty and the innocent alike. So here's another question that I have at the end of Angelheart. That's, did Harry ever have a chance to save himself? Was there any moment in the film when he could have acted differently, or was he just purely fated to damnation? And I don't think there's an entirely satisfying answer to that question. Cypher states in the sequence that I've just shown you, he says, "You are doomed as soon as you split that boy open." So basically nothing within the film's time frame could have been done otherwise if we take him at his word. But there's an earlier scene in the film, in this moment when, after the first murder has occurred, when Harry tells Cypher that he's not going to work for him anymore, that things have gotten too intense. Cypher agrees to raise his fee as a way of keeping him on the case. And this is, of course, the famous egg scene. I wonder if the screenplay said "eat egg" menacingly in there. So I always kind of wonder, if he had said yes to the egg, would that have meant his soul would have been that the soul problem would have been resolved there and then? Or more importantly, the more important question is, if he hadn't taken the offer of more money to continue on the case, would the outcome have been different? Again, it sort of looms in the back of my mind, but just how fatalistic this film is. Is it the story of a person who continuously makes the wrong decisions and those lead him to eternal damnation at the end? Or is it just a story of somebody who's so completely fated to hell that literally no other decision he made at any other point could have helped him? I like to think that it's the former, because it kind of seems dramatically unsatisfying to have a character whose decisions ultimately don't matter, a protagonist whose decisions ultimately don't matter. But there's certainly space for discussion there. Perhaps I'm the only person who's ever thought about this. There's another cryptic detail that is at the end of Angelheart that I'd like to mention finally, and I think it works against the film's definitive sense of closure as well. So the matter of paternity of Epiphany's young son is raised early in the film, since he tells Harry that he has no father, but rather that she was impregnated by the gods during a voodoo ceremony. But possibly some version of Cypher was the father. At the film's end, we see the boy with the same yellow eyes, which we'd previously seen on Harry. And I think that maybe this is a reference to Rosemary's Baby, the whole idea of he has his father's eyes, the famous line there, which suggests that the boy, who is descended from both the devil in this reading and Johnny Favorite, may himself be the Antichrist. In his last perverse gesture, Angelheart's closure effect is punctured by a gesture towards a continuing demonic scheme to which the relatively closed saga of Johnny Favorite and Harry Angel is marginal. This apocalyptic addition, small enough to be easily ignored, suggests that the final image, the final elevator descending into hell sequence, might allegorize not only Harry's descent into hell, but that of all humanity. And that's what I have. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We have kind of an ironic situation that has happened here at the end. Yes? Music got flagged in the Facebook stream, so I apologize to the people watching on Facebook. Got a temporary delay, but more ironically, of course, is the fact that the YouTube feed got incredibly slowed down and paused twice for clips that are on YouTube.
Oh dear.
Yeah, so apologies out there, everyone watching in the Twitchiverse. However, got the full the full version.
And is that the one that's archived?
Well, we have the one that's actually in front of me is the one that we have for the archive,
I see.
which is neither. So
yeah, okay.
There is never interruption in mine.
So anybody who was interrupted will have the occasion to go back and see, the golden insights that tripped off my tongue in those lost moments.
Indeed. Just rather, I'm just super amused by the idea that you were using YouTube videos and that YouTube found a violation in the policy of showing videos from YouTube.
That is pretty ironic. That's for darn sure.
So I kind of want to work backwards, if that's fine with you, in terms of my thoughts and responding. One thing that occurred to me was in terms of this being Faustian, it is Faustian, but you have, unlike in Faust, you have the absence of the possibility of redemption.
Yeah. So, I mean, I'm not an expert, but I know that there are different traditions of Faust, because he is redeemed at the end of some versions, right? But the tradition of Marlowe is the one in which he is not redeemed. So Angelheart, I guess, sits a little closer to that tradition. But yeah, I mean, the question, I guess, concerns like not just actual redemption, but the possibility of redemption. And if it is true, if we take the film at his word, because as I said, the film feels slightly contradictory in that regard, because I always want to take that egg scene as like, this is your big moment that you're missing, right? You're missing the possibility here, just like he's missing all the clues around him about Cypher's real nature. But if you don't take that reading, then yeah, it seems that there is no possibility of redemption. That this is a deeply fatalistic story about somebody who is doomed to eternal damnation, no matter what.
Well, I mean, to take your reading here, then through the lens of Marlowe, right? Faust is, in very medieval fashion, drug off through a hell mouth at the end of the Marlowe version, and the eating of the soul then becomes that entering of the hell mouth of perhaps his soul.
Perhaps, yeah, and of course the elevator descending is sort of the transplanting of that sort of idea into a noir idiom, and the film is very clever about that. And one thing that I always want to pay more attention to is because we get intercuts that feel non-diegetic of the elevator descending somewhat earlier in the film, and I always wondered, is like, okay, well, maybe we only get that once he's past a corner that he can't come back from, because I'm pretty sure they only start happening once the action is turned to New Orleans. So I think that maybe there's something there about where the elevator imagery starts appearing, but it's not something I've 100% worked through in my head. I rewatched the film yesterday, so and I hadn't in a number of years. So my mind is sort of full of fresh ideas, which didn't obviously make it into the essay itself.
Interesting. I'll throw another one to you then. You made the comparison between Scorsese and De Niro's appearance, but the latter picture, the last shot you showed of De Niro looking out at the audience looks so clearly like Olivier as Richard III.
That is a really interesting insight for sure. That's worth unpacking. I always thought that Olivier in that performance, what's interesting about it is that the film has this very theatrical kind of vibe to it for the most part, but whenever his deformity is emphasized, then it turns much more cinematic. Then we have like dramatic low angles on his response when the nephew asks him to take him on his back and stuff like that. There is something about the affiliation of deformity and theatrical villainy with sort of conspicuous uses of film form. So that is very interesting. That had not exactly occurred to me. And of course, it's striking how different and how much younger De Niro looks That could happen when a person shaves one's beard. I haven't tried that in quite a while.
So like even the braiding and the hat and stuff, it looks very much like that, the costumes.
That's right. Yeah. I feel like there's something going on with that costuming choice in particular. The figure in black to me sort of codes as female throughout most of its appearances. Maybe it's the fact that we first see it in this position of cleaning a wall. So it's associated with kind of domestic labor meant to clean up after male violence. But then at the end, we have De Niro, wearing this costume. And there's part of me that thinks that that the figure in black is not the film's most effective element. Something seems a little too obvious about it, perhaps. But I must say, I saw the film quite a few times before I really even clocked that it's De Niro in the costume in that last scene. He's like on screen for less than a second, I think. So it plays a bit like a little Easter egg or something like that, a little bonus.
Well, it's funny because you get that special appearance by Robert De Niro, and it's like, is that the special appearance? Because the other one just seems like a normal role, not a special appearance.
I know, yeah. But movie trailers don't use that kind of language anymore, do they? So much
or introducing, right? You never see introducing anymore.
And it almost is like it almost seems to suggest to be it's like De Niro wouldn't normally be in a role like this in the 80s, right? So we have to frame it a little differently. Like, look, he's slumming in our like seedy little film here.
No, it's because I hadn't watched the trailer in a very long time, so I'd forgotten that's how it was framed. But then when you were talking about these two roles he's sort of playing, in terms of like the black figure itself, I know you said you don't want to get too much into race with this film, but there is a sort of like legacy of the ghost story itself, particularly in American horror fiction of the 19th century, that does sort of like relate these dark black figures to narratives about race and horror and particularly white panic. So I think that
absolutely
might be something we're seeing here, because it's more present, I feel like. Well, it works just like Sleepy Hollow, right? It's this phantom black figure that's terrorizing someone from New England because of erudition, and then it still exists as you move to the South. So I think perhaps there might be something there as well.
Yeah, no, I think that definitely should be taken on by somebody in some other format for sure. It's a few years before Ghost, and it's always struck me, of course, many people have talked about this, that in Ghost, heaven is white and hell is black. It uses the most like infantile, basic visual vocabulary to represent the choices of the afterlife. And no thought seems to have been given whatsoever to how that maps onto the film's internal racial politics. And I feel like sort of the same thing is going on in Angelheart.
One of the quotes that occurs in the last monologue by De Niro is about the reflection. And we've talked a lot already this year about the absence of the soul and lacking a reflection as a common part of mythology, particularly in vampire studies. And so I'm wondering in terms of this film too, why bring that up, that the mirror is going to reflect sort of like this truth, because the mirror obviously doesn't reflect a truth, right? It reflects an opposite.
Then there's mirror motifs throughout the film. At one point, after having sex with Epiphany during the famously explicit sex scene, he walks over and smashes a mirror, and then we see his face reflected in this spider webbed. It's like a very cinematically effective moment of his face being, shattered into all of these traces. And so it is interesting because as you say, it's like in vampire lore, mirrors are supposed to reveal the fact that a vampire doesn't have a soul. At least that's the idea, I suppose. Here he actually has essentially two souls. His soul dysfunction is of a different character. And it's not that mirrors actually reveal it. It's more like a motif about how when faced with this like intolerable self-realization, it's associated with him looking at himself in mirrors, because you're supposed to know who that person is when you look into a mirror, but instead it supplies the visual vocabulary for him, realizing that the intolerable thing about himself. And unlike Oedipus, he doesn't gouge his eyes out in consequence. Instead, he runs through the streets of New Orleans, and then so yeah, I feel like if I wanted to go down a Lacanian rabbit hole about the mirror phase and so on, I certainly could do that, about how, what's reflected in a mirror, that's a picture, that's never actually you. But then what is actually you? How do we construct self itself? But when confronted by the fact that you're a different person than you realize, than you've always thought, it seems like the destruction of a mirror, or being unable to look at yourself in a mirror, these are appropriate like visual metaphors for that realization.
Yeah, I definitely I mean, theoretically your mind does go to Lacan, obviously, and then you just sort of like, you always do that with mirrors, though. It's a trap, right?
It is. I kind of wish there were some other way to do it. Perhaps there is somewhere, but grad school me would be all over that. But I haven't flexed my Lacanian muscles in a long time.
Well, because then you get the implication of the incest, and I mean, it's just this giant psychoanalytic filmic place that you go. That's very like of the time, 1980s film theory.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
You posed a question, and I want to pose 3 different answers.
Mm-hmm. Go for it.
You said, why can't Cypher simply claim the soul at any time? So I want to give you 3 possible things that came to my mind. He wants him to commit more sin, as he says, I'm guided in your hand.
Yeah.
It's part of the sort of Dante-esque torture of him in a visceral sense, since the soul is not visceral. And then, of course, it goes back to the Faustian idea of 24 years on Earth. He gets 12 years, but he gets 12 years because he's only half the person, right? He's overtaken another person.
That's interesting. I hadn't thought about that. So I like those answers. I like my answers too, that like he can't because the plot wouldn't happen. That seems to be like actually a just answer. And maybe that actually corresponds to a few of your suggestions too. One thing I think, okay, he wants him to do more sin. He says, guided by my hand, you've committed these murders. But it's interesting that he says Weinsap is also dead. Nasty accident, he says. So clearly Cypher can kill people when he feels like it. He doesn't flat out need Harry to do it for him, right? If he wants to settle these accounts, he can do it other ways. Clearly this is like fun for him or something, that it is a kind of demonic joust or something like that, watching these events unfold. And it is interesting too that like I'm quite fascinated by De Niro's performance choices in this film too, because he's for the most part unusually subdued. I could count on one hand the number of like very underplayed De Niro performances. Wag the Dog is another. A Last Tycoon is definitely another. But in this one, it seems in some of his scenes, he barely feels interested in the scene at all. But then he plays it with much more relish in that final confrontation scene. He seems like he's actually having fun for the first time. And it seems like that has something to do with this narrative having come to its completion. I don't know, that's something else which sort of flared up in my mind now and again. Is like, okay, so De Niro's famous for his being a method actor. How do you method play the devil? Like when confronted with a character who I guess lacks psychology as we conventionally understand it, how does he grapple with that? Couldn't find anything where he talks about this. If I ever talk to Robert De Niro, that seems unlikely. That's the question I'm going to be asking.
I mean, to that point, though, I mean, another De Niro movie that has a similar kind of performance by, I believe, his teacher, Lee Strasberg in Godfather 2.
Mhm.
There are gestural similarities between the performances and things, not to mention just the type of like completely devious person that seems very weak and mild.
Yeah, for sure. And I was always struck by how his first Oscar-winning performance, that one, right, as the younger Vito, he plays it pretty flat. Not flat, that's the wrong word, but he plays it very restrained. I wonder in Angelheart, is it maybe working against Mickey Rourke's energy? Because Mickey Rourke seems to be throwing himself headlong into every scene pretty much. So maybe the only place to go against that is lower. So you can only get effects by speaking softly and doing everything in this very calm, controlled kind of way. Could be as simple as that, but there's kind of performance aspects here that I feel like I've not fully grappled with.
Well, because the opposite would be Pacino in Devil's Advocate, right?
Right, or Jack Nicholson in The Witches of Eastwick. Like,
oh, sure.
The devil is a good go big part most of the time, but this one's very much in contrast with those performances.
I mean, well, The Prophecy, right? Viggo Mortensen's performance pretty.
Yeah, that's true.
Subtle.
Yeah. Also a low-key devil there. That's for sure. Yeah.
I mean, it's more what he says that's the horrifying stuff, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's always been a thing too. That like with absolute power, you just can kind of like be still if you actually have that kind of power.
Yeah, you don't have to remind people. You don't have to prove that you're so powerful. Yeah,
that's one of my favorite lines in The Exorcist when when Regan says that would be I forget,
far too vulgar a display of power.
Yeah, exactly. And that's just opening a drawer, right?
Yeah.
So I thought it was one of my favorite lines and I went blank on it. That's always a good sign, right? Which of course this film was strangely compared to The Exorcist, which
yeah. I'm surprised it wasn't The Omen or even Rosemary's Baby. It seems to have a little more of the DNA of, but it's interesting that like the elevator pitch of like, oh, this film is The Exorcist meets Chinatown. That's normally not supposed to go in the trailer, right?
Yeah.
That's supposed to go on like the proposal for the money or something.
Yeah. I mean, it is closer to Chinatown, I would say. I mean,
yes, definitely.
Some other films that came to mind to me tonight were David Lynch's Lost Highway from '97 and Old Boy from 2003.
Yeah.
As sort of like a trio to show together, I guess.
Yeah, that's interesting. I was thinking about Vertigo too, as like puppet master villains, which Old Boy certainly has, where the character, the protagonist, appears to act freely. They think that they're doing what they want, but they're actually very carefully being managed, that the villain has foreseen every step, and ultimately the character is doing it for the benefit of that puppet master rather than their own benefit. So I think that there is something there about like how villains are constructed, that sort of thing. I confess, Lost Highway I have not seen in quite a long time.
It's actually got a really similar plot now that I sit and think about it, because he's met with this like guy with a video camera who like tells him to call his house, and he's at his house while he's standing in front of him and things. I mean, you get a lot of these similar ideas of being in multiple places, and
right?
Things, and also just a disintegration of the mind.
I need to rewatch that one. It's been too long.
I did a whole class on Lynch not too unrecently, and I spent a long time staring at that. And I'm also just a huge Bill Pullman fan. Let's see. I was wondering early on in the piece, there's a huge difference, it seems, too, just in the terms of American devil stories on film versus European devil stories on film. And this seems to be a very traditionally American devil story on film, even though it does have these I mean, ancient in terms of Greek, European roots, and medieval roots with Faustus, but it does seem at its heart to be sort of like an American version of a devil story. And you point to the devil and Daniel Webster early on too.
Yeah.
Because it does, as I said earlier, in terms of race, it does have this New England and the devil vibe to it. There's a Protestantism about it that's distinctly American, I feel like, in relationship to the devil.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah, it's definitely not a very Catholic film. It does feel like a very Protestant kind of. If you take it as far as that, it might even have a vaguely Calvinistic kind of vibe about, about being predestined to sin, predestined to damnation, etc. And yet it was not written by Paul Schrader. But I guess I think that it features such American settings, and it features such very American actors for the most part. There's a distinctly American, like this is an American version. And of course the connecting of the Faust story, of course, but also the Robert Johnson story is fluttering in the back of it. I don't know if it's visible in the film or if it's just in the novel, but Harry Angel's detective agency is called Crossroads. So a lot of the same imagery drawn from that story is here as well. But displaced onto Johnny Favorite, the crooner. But then we have Toot Sweet. So we do have I guess he didn't sell his soul to the devil, but like a Satanist guitar playing bluesman as well. So that's all being cited. And I think more could be done to unpack that, and more could be done with the kind of peculiar role that crooning as a style is put in relationship to the blues. And I think a certain amount could be done to unpack that, but it's all very American styles of one kind or another that you're right. It's not a very European kind of film. Even the churches as locations, they don't have a particularly European vibe to how they're photographed and what they look like. So it's a very and I guess I feel, as a Canadian, I feel unequipped to comment on the role that Southernness plays in it as well. But regionality feels very important. And Harry Angel keeps on mentioning that he's from Brooklyn, including a line that I always wondered if it's a non sequitur or not, where he says, I'm an atheist, I'm from Brooklyn. Like there's supposed to be a logical relationship between these two things, but this kind of hard-headedness feels like something that's very that's not just very American but very Yankee, right? So yeah, I feel like I've prattled on about that one. Perhaps you might be able to fill me in on what you have in mind as well.
Well, I mean, also just the settings, right? New York City in the 80s, at the time this film is coming out, is sort of like in its dying flutters of authentic hedonism, for lack of a better phrase. Because I mean, almost immediately after this, you're going to start getting the Disneyfication of Times Square and stuff. Even though the film has a sort of ambiguous time setting. And then New Orleans as a choice is like perpetually time locked, I feel like, in the popular imagination to that sort of Anne Rice, Lestat time period, right, of being a French city, and having sort of like it engulfed itself in Southern Gothic permanently. I mean, like I was in Savannah this summer. It's got the same sort of like vibe to it. And I think there's these specific places in the American South that no matter, we could be in the year 3000, and I feel like they still have that legacy that comes with it. And it's a lot of it's been lost if you actually go there because it's become so touristy. But I think that cachet remains around these places. And in the 80s in New York, I think it was just assumed, right? You had all these specials about urban decay and things in New York, and like how the Lower East Side was just uninhabitable and things.
Yeah, so this is interesting because I wondered if I should work this in, because I just discovered this the other day. But in this interesting little book from 1991 here, Horror Writers on Horror Film, there's a piece by Anne Rice in this, and she loved the hell out of Angelheart. So she keeps going back to it. She says Angelheart is the modern horror classic, not just but the modern horror classic. It's got atmosphere, and there's dimension to Mickey Rourke's character in the film. I thought the suspense, the tension, photography, the shots of the churches, the glimpses of things in his memory, and the use of New Orleans, all very atmospheric. Terrific camera work. She goes on to favorably compare it to The Fly, where she says The Fly is ultimately too silly because the idea of turning into a fly is preposterous. But she says Angelheart transcends the genre. I don't think there's a comic moment in Angelheart. So interesting.
Yeah. I need to find this book. I saw you posted it yesterday, and I was like, I wrote it down. I was like, I must find copy, because it just seems kind of wild.
There's a lot of really interesting stuff in it. I've cited it a number of different times. But yeah, the Anne Rice one, and it's dictated to Catherine Ramsland, her biographer, who also has a separate paper. And it feels very free form. It feels like off the top of my head, this. It feels like it has no structure whatsoever. But it is interesting that she's, as an authentic Orleanian, she's very fond of a film made by a British filmmaker that took place there, because it plays, as you say, it plays every New Orleans cliche.
Oh yeah,
completely straight.
Yeah, I mean, it almost like devoids any of the idea of like joy. It's like driven people to investigate these things.
Mm-hmm.
My spit guard just freaked out. Yeah, it's fascinating in that way, because it's also like even just the color palette of the film sort of like is drained in New Orleans. You get very cold. Mm-hmm. Blue filters on the lens and things.
Yeah, and watching the film again, I watching it yesterday, my biggest complaint was that it might take a little too long to get to New Orleans. That I feel like the Brooklyn passages at the beginning, there's just too many scenes that don't really go anywhere, and structurally it feels like the movie doesn't 100% take off till it relocates.
That's a noir problem, though. I feel like
kind of chunky first acts.
Yeah, because it wants to set you up for misdirections and
yeah.
And I mean, I'm not as versed in noir as horror, but I found that to be common.
Yeah,
when I've watched
I think that makes a certain amount of sense. Maybe even more so with neo and retro noir than in the original cycle.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, because you have a much more tight film.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's interesting because when horror seems to want to go serious, it needs to get itself toward 2 hours, right? It needs to break free of the 70-90 minute, and it needs to make it to the 2+ hour to be like a Rosemary's Baby or an Exorcist, and bring with it some sort of pedigree, I guess, of just like being tomic in its completeness.
Yeah, but more recently we get things like the Conjuring 2, which is like 2.5 hours for no reason that I could discern. It doesn't have an epic kind of scope to it. It's not The Shining or something like that. It just doesn't feel like it should be this long.
No, those are kind of I mean, especially in that kind of like franchising, right? When you see those moves, because that doesn't make any sense, because you know you're gonna have a sequel anyway. So
yeah.
There's not going to be an Angelheart sequel.
No, I don't know that there could be. There's literally no story to tell at the end.
So I want to thank you very much for coming on tonight. Really appreciate it. I want to invite the audience to take the survey that Juan is putting into the various chats. Hopefully YouTube won't find issue with that. And I invite you all to tune in tomorrow night for Brandon Graffius's talk. And as always, stay spooky. thank you once again. I really appreciate it, and I'm always glad to hear somebody talk about Angelheart.
No problem. I hope it wasn't a little too academic. I took out as much jargon as I thought that I could. Plausibly.
I mean, we're an academic series, so.
Well, I know, yeah, but I didn't want to be too dry, so I took out every reference to Todorov in my section about genre, for example, because I was like, I just don't want to dump too many concepts out there.
Sure. No, I mean, I enjoyed it. I definitely want to go back and rewatch the film again now with a different set of ideas in mind, as happens to me frequently during the month of October.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I watched it yesterday morning, and I saw things that I did not see before that I wished I had when I was writing the paper. So that always happens.
It is the way of things, right? You stumble upon the new over and over again.
Mm-hmm. And heard too, because it has a very rich soundscape as well. This sort of creepy song that gets played now and again that Harry hums that turns out to be a Johnny favorite song. There's kind of interesting thing about this melody running through it.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. And actually, that's funny because I think that's actually what Facebook got mad at was the song more so than the actual film clip. I have no idea what YouTube's problem was. What I was trying to tell you at the beginning that I didn't get to was that one of the pictures I wanted to make sure I juxtaposed was the Wolfen version of Dracula with